Hello, everybody. I'm Chris Silvius. Welcome to the Aftershow. We're going to talk about the Cambrian strata. Does it take millions of years to form, or was it the result of a flood? Are we going to call it the Cambrian period, like an epoch of time, deep time, over millions of years, or merely thousands of years, like in the biblical record? And so you would consider that the Cambrian stage of the flood, because at that time the ecosystem of everything that's at the lowest parts of the sea level is destroyed. So those major marine body plants, which represent a majority of, all of them, because most life on the earth is aquatic. So anyways, we're going to go start with the U-Haul website. Okay, I'm a toll booth operator, so I see a lot of U-Hauls, and often, or like every U-Haul has like an interesting fact on natural sciences. So I'm going to show you one, because oftentimes they will include the modern paradigm, of deep time, saying that this particular plant or this fossil is millions of years old. what have you. Now, that's I can see to that theory, but that isn't the only one out there, even though they try to blur the line. So U-Haul is just going but based on what is marketed, as science. And so I don't really blame them necessarily. Maybe uh, the person who constructed all of that and put it on their website, because their website is just full of this stuff, maybe they should think about what they're teaching everybody, in America, as they see the U-Hauls crossing by and they're thinking, oh, wow, these are fossils that are millions of years old. And it's like we evolved from some slime billions of years ago. That's actually not true. You were created by God in his image around 6,000 years ago. A man called Adam and then Eve got together and they produced all of us. Here we are. So, anyways, I'm going to share my screen and we'll get started with the the main attraction of the show, which is going to be this U-Haul website filled with propaganda about certain facts of the Cambrian layer of. Here we are. Let's just load up real quick. Did you know, it says about Alabama and the specific plants that are found to that area, very rare plants. So interesting place to be. But the actual bedrock granite that the plants are growing on the topsoil, the exposed rock that's in that area has an age. And so they're going to give kind of a story of the age of the rock and the creatures that inhabited that particular area that was buried by certain grains and minerals, and then they solidified, became a fossil. So here we go. Did you know that the ancient Upper Cambrian age Katona dolomite found in the Bibb Country glades could be anywhere from 500 to 544 million years old? So it gives a question, did you know that? Well, how do you know that exactly? Does the person, that authorized this to be put on their website, do they know that it's that old? Or are they just merely questioning it? Because it seems to be a dogmatic prescription of the modern paradigm. It says that this ancient rock formation is from the Paleozoic era, which had three different periods: upper, middle, and lower. The term Cambrian is an epoch which is a particular period of geologic history considered remarkable or noteworthy, and the extraordinary era began 544 million years ago, lasted about 291 million years. So that's according to secular wisdom, that this lasted, over 300 million years or something. This this ecosystem, okay, and in their mind, it really took it like billions of years to evolve until it was complete, and then it went extinct, because the only way that you get a fossil is you rapidly bury it and deeply so that it can be preserved. No microbial organisms or outside weathering, erosion, or anything can get to the remains of the carcass of the animal, and decay it, which is naturally going to happen. So you have to rapidly bury it, and these are what they refer to as extinction events. So the Cambrian era, it says, the epoch represents an important point in the history of life on Earth because it was when most of the major groups of animals first appeared in the fossil records. And what they're talking about is the layers of strata underneath the Cambrian has just single-celled organisms, and that's all that you see. When you get to the Cambrian strata, there is a diversity of major, highly specialized body plans of marine life. So there's no evolution in between, and that's actually what you see throughout the rest of the fossil record. When you see another major group of animal, you start out with fish down here, and you go to amphibian. Well, in between those, there's an actual absence, layers of strata that just contain a vacancy of no fossils whatsoever. And so you're really just looking at different ecosystems being destroyed, and their complexity happens to coincide with their altitude above sea level. So if you find, the Cambrian marine life down here, you could conclude that that was the first organisms to be destroyed from a global flood, considering that it's going to rain for 40 days and 40 nights, scour the mountains, bring all of that rock and dirt into the low places, the oceans, cover those organisms, progressively bury the earth, cover it in dirt and rock, establish it into layers by basic principles of hydrologic sorting and liquefaction, where 200-foot tidal waves with no continents to interrupt them are going up and down, and so they could establish the layers. When you have a majority of the fossil record in its entirety consisting of animals without a backbone that live in the water, you're looking at marine deposit. You're looking at a flood deposit. It's very good evidence for it. So they're saying that these major groups of animals, they first appear in the Cambrian, and that in itself is evidence that they had not actually evolved. But let's continue. This epoch is known to many as the Cambrian explosion because of the short time span in which diverse life forms appeared. Not only are the Bib Country glades home to rare plants previously unknown to science, the areas also feature ancient rock formations that have been present on Earth for hundreds of millions of years. So these exposed rocks that are over there in Alabama says that they've been there over millions of years. So where are they getting this? Well, they're getting it from the conventional wisdom. The majority of the scientific community, which has a PhD and has a secular job, and they're expected to publish their results in prestigious scientific journals. There's a market in that, and it's controlled, by one status quo, which they have to maintain the market itself and minimize any competing theories. Anybody that's going to change or shift the paradigm, if you will, is going to have a lot of money and resources in order to accomplish that. So now I'm going to go to these slides here. Here's some facts about the Cambrian strata. And if anybody wishes to join, and you're waiting in the background, just let me know in the comment section, and then I'll go to the home screen and let you in. So anybody's welcome to join. It's a total open mic discussion. If you have anything to say about evolution in general or anything else that's on your mind, you're welcome to come in here and elaborate. So facts about the Cambrian strata. It consists mostly of granite basement rock. So there's sedimentary rock in it, which contains marine life, obviously the fossils, but the majority of it is either pulverized granite or actual layers of granite that were formed from a molten state. And so they formed the basement rock of all of the sedimentary layers, which would be upon it. Now, underneath that is the Precambrian, which is just nothing but the basement rock, the igneous basement rock, the granite, and then in that is single-celled organisms. So you have mostly granite basement rock. The geologic strata below it contains only single-celled life, and the sedimentary rock contains highly specialized body plans, which we're talking about the Cambrian strata. A sedimentary rock within that mixture of granite bedrock, that contains these major body plans so there's no signs of evolution in between. Therefore, why would you conclude that evolution has taken place over deep time, that these rocks are millions of years old? Are you concluding that because you think that these animals evolved in a certain order, or are you concluding that based on some radiometric date, that's done by a process which I guarantee you the person who authorized that to be put on the U-Haul website has no knowledge about? But anyways, this is Stephen J. Gould, PhD in paleontology. He says the extreme rarity of transitionals in the fossil record persists as the trade secret of paleontology. Evolution trees that adorn our textbooks have data only at the tips and nodes of the branches. The rest is inference, however reasonable, not the evidence of fossils. He's saying that there really isn't transitional forms at all. According to Dr. Colin Patterson, who is a senior paleontologist at the British Museum of Natural History, he said, "I fully agree with your comments on the lack of direct illustration of evolutionary transitions in my book. If I knew of any fossil or living, I would certainly have included them. I will lay it on the line. There is not one such fossil for which one might make a watertight argument. So he's talking about the same thing Gould is talking about, which is the evidence, the tips and nodes of the branches. So you have the ichthyostega on the bottom, which on the geologic column he'd be at the top, and the euthanopter would be on the bottom. So you just reverse this image. You have this creature with no digits evolving into the creature with digits, and over just 20, 30 million years approximately, uh, this is happening, and but what they actually see is them together. They put them in that order and arrange the date because that's what fits their theory, but it's really just forensic science, and we'll talk about radiometric dating in a second. But the actual evolution of the animals, you're still looking at a fish, even the ichthyostega, which has digits. It's a fish. It lives in the water, and if you go higher than that, then you're just going to find the amphibians, the insects, which live kind of like along the shore. So this is not an inference necessarily of evolution unless you're looking for evolution. Uh, the transitional features of anatomy coincide with transitional ecosystems. The ecosystems, the progressive complexity from single cells at the bottom to thinking Neanderthals at the top is a pure coincidence based on a design feature where biological complexity increases with the ecosystem's altitude above sea level. So basically, animals get complex the higher that you go up on land. So this is why you have what appears to be an evolution if you're looking for evolution, but not necessarily. It could be a global flood. You have fish, amphibian, reptile, mammal, and that is the stages that the flood buried these animals. The entire geologic column would form again if you were to flood the whole world with just soft silica infused mud starting from the ocean floor. It's going to bury the animals, in an order based on complexity, just because you're going from the low places where there's primitive life and the high places where there's complex life, and burying it in mud and rock from the bottom of the ocean floors all the way to the top. So transitional fossils are the remains of ancient life forms that evolved from nested hierarchies. They transitional forms, they say that this is evolution. What it could be is a nested hierarchy. So just a isolated region of a particular group of animals, and they also have ascending complexity. Major and distinct groups of creatures in an isolated ecosystem that all share similarities in an ascending or progressive pattern. Founder of taxonomy Carl Linnaeus called him the second Adam because Adam named the animals in that one language that he had, and then Carl Linnaeus came back and named them in Latin. So call him the second Adam. And he was a biblical creationist. The ones who named the animals came up with the theory of the fixity of the species, suggesting that animals cannot break away from their major kind. So you're not going to be able to get these animals to evolve, and that's never been demonstrated today. The founder of stratigraphy, establishing the first basic principles of geology, which any freshman will learn in their first year of getting a degree for geology. Stenos Prodromus was book or an article that he wrote where he gave the geologic history of Tuscany, which is Earth from the perspective of a global flood. And so the very people that are responsible for giving us the names of the animals and the basic principles of stratigraphy, believed in God created the kinds, that they couldn't evolve, and that he created the geologic strata. He destroyed major kinds of the pre-flood world with a global flood. So what we have here is a pure coincidence. It's not any major evolution. It's still a fish, and then you don't find anything in between the fish and the amphibian, as well as the amphibian and the reptile. Major vacancies in the strata, no transitional forms. You have transitional forms at the bottom and at the top of, the Cambrian, for instance, or the Devonian, which is what these animals are a part of. There is a ascending pattern there, but it's for the same reason that there's kind of a ascending in complexity of all of the animals in the fossil record. This is based on an ascending order of progressive complexity, depending on a creature's altitude above sea level. There's two ways to look at it. There's a vacancy in between the major groups of animals where there is no transitional forms. Inherently, that's why they call it a missing link, is really because there's no link. So 90% of the entire fossil record consists of aquatic animals without a backbone, mostly clams and shells. About 9% of the geologic timescale represents land animals, and less than 1% of the entire fossil record consists of reptiles or mammals. So this is a marine deposit. It's more logical and more fitting with the evidence that there was a flood and not some kind of evolution. So there's no reason to believe that these animals evolved based on the fossil record or even based on geology. So let's talk about the radiometric dates. Russell Humphreys, who has a PhD in physics, said the high helium retention levels suggested to us and many other creationists that the helium simply had not had enough time to diffuse out of the zircons, and that recent accelerated nuclear decay had produced over 1 billion years worth of helium. So the uranium lead dates of the granite rock that they're testing is yielding billions of years of decay. Whereas if you measure the diffusion of the helium, which is in tiny zircon crystals within the granite rock, all that heavy basement rock with all of the overlaying sedimentary rock on top of it, that helium will escape. It's one of the, if not the lightest element in the universe, and so has an escape level that can be measured. And so if you measure how much helium has actually diffused from the zircon crystal, it's only a few thousand years worth of diffusion, whereas the uranium lead decay rates around them, would contradict that. So you have a contradiction here. You have one side of the spectrum saying, well, this rock is billions of years old, and then the tiny zircon crystals within that rock say, I'm only thousands of years old. Any object that is older than 20 carbon-14 half-lives should not have any detectable carbon-14. In other words, since carbon-14's half-life is 5,730 years, 20 half-lives would be 114,600 years, should be no detectable carbon-14 in a sample that old. That's why they wouldn't date a dinosaur bone with carbon-14, because they don't believe that carbon-14 can last for millions of years. But if you find, hypothetically, carbon-14 in a dinosaur bone, you would have to say that it was introduced within the last 114,600 years, because it can't last any longer than that. But we've actually found it not only in dinosaur bones, but in diamond. And so it becomes physically impossible to say that there was some kind of contamination, where the carbon-14 intruded into the material during its petrification process, retaining that carbon so that we could measure it today. You could say that it was contamination if you're looking at C14 in a dinosaur bone, but if you're looking at coal, which they found it in also, or diamond, like the hardest substance, on Earth, then there's no way that the carbon-14 can intrude in it. Therefore, the Earth, suggests that it cannot be any more than, 115,000 years old. But then the other radiometric dating methods will yield ages of billions of years. Now, 8 PhD scientists joined together in 1997 to study the radioisotope evidence before the age of the Earth. They were called the Rate Group Radioisotopes in the Age of the Earth. They spent 8 years on the project and studied many radioisotopic dating methods, including carbon-14. And so I gave you the examples. You have the helium retention rate, you have carbon-14 and dinosaur bones, coal, and diamonds. These conflict with other radiometric dating techniques. The rate group tested 10 samples of coal, which it obtained from the U.S. Department of Energy Coal Sample Bank. The 10 samples were of coal taken from coal fields all across the United States. The samples represented a wide range of standard time frames in the geologic column, including the Cenozoic, Mesozoic, Paleozoic. Coal samples were considered to be tens to hundreds of millions of years old by traditional old Earth standards. However, to the surprise of many observers, all 10 samples of coal had significant levels of detectable carbon-14. If you heat a layer of clay from the bottom up, it will be softer at the top because it's further away from the source of heat at the bottom. So if you know anything about Play-Doh, you leave it out and it dries and then it becomes hard like a stone. So you put clay, get a layer of it, like a cake of clay, if you will, and then you heat it from the bottom, and over time, you leave it there at a certain temperature, it will actually begin to turn to stone from the bottom up because the top is further away from the source of heat, which is causing it to solidify, and that's at the bottom. So if heat generated in the Precambrian basement rock produced radioactive elements, then the same effect would result. You have heat producing radioactive elements during the flood at the bottom, and then has less effect on the elements at the tops, because the theory is that radioactive elements were formed as a result of the flood. So this geophysical activity occurring deep within the granite basement rock is fusing lighter elements together into super heavy elements, which then rapidly decay into the known radioactive elements that we see today. The uranium at the bottom, in the deep parts of the crust of the Earth, is actually producing, most of the Earth's heat, they've determined scientifically. So a lot of radioactive decay going on deep within the Earth, and uranium at the bottom will be more stable than other radioactive elements at the top because the heat necessary to bind the protons and neutrons is generated from the bottom. So if you have huge voltages of electricity surging from deep within the crust of the Earth, that heat is going to fuse elements at the bottom, very well. It will bring in more neutrons and more protons and cause the atoms of the elements, to become heavy, to the point where they actually become unstable. But if there's enough energy, you can, even though it's going to be unstable, you can it will be a lot more stable than elements that fuse at the top. And so they will actually decay faster, meaning that you can only measure it in millions of years, whereas the elements at the bottom, which would have been closer to the heat, they will have stronger bonds, enabling them to decay at very slow rates over billions of years. So lower layers yield abundant, long-lived elements that can undergo billions of years of decay, and the top layers yield abundant, short-lived elements that cannot undergo billions of years of decay. It's only millions of years at the top. So when you're seeing billions of years down here and millions of years up here, you have a relative perspective, of where you are in the geologic column. And you can apply various, radiometric dating techniques and determine, maybe even precisely where you are in the column, from the Cambrian to the Pennsylvanian, Triassic, and up at the top, the Paleocene, or whatever they call it. You could possibly even do this with radiometric dating and get it down to be precise, because the process itself is precise, measuring, how much of the parent element has decayed into the daughter element. Like in uranium, it decays into lead. So you're measuring the lead essentially, and assuming that all the decay came from the uranium, or all of the lead came from the uranium, that the decay rate has been constant. And so it's not necessarily true, though, even though that's what they push in the mainstream journals. Now, here is a prestigious journal, Journal of Geoscience and Environment Protection, where it presents two opposing views on the origin of natural radioactive elements. The first is that supernovas basically produced the radioactive elements, which then ended up on Earth during its formation and all other planets, basically. And then the other theory, which is presented in this article, in this journal, is that the radioactive elements were formed from the Earth itself. So there's from Secular Wisdom. Major corporations hold patents for electrical devices that on a small scale accelerate alpha, beta, and gamma decay, thereby decontaminating hazardous nuclear waste. An interesting patent awarded to William Barker is described as follows. When a Van de Graaff generator generates 50,000 to 500,000 volts across radioactive material for at least 30 minutes, alpha, beta, and gamma particles sometimes escape. This large negative voltage is thought to lower each nucleus energy barrier. Nuclear fusion experiments producing radioactive elements. Proton 21 experiment, the electrodynamics laboratory. A Z-pinch acts over a broad plasma flow. Many nuclei could merge into super heavy nuclei, much heavier than any chemical element found naturally. And most merged nuclei would be unstable, meaning radioactive, and they would rapidly decay into the natural occurring radioactive elements that we see today. So there we have experiments not only producing the heavy elements, scientific journals coming out and saying that we think that the Earth produced the radioactive elements instead of the stars. And then you have the conflicting dates, with the diffusion of helium diffusion rates, and the carbon-14 problem. So why isn't this being published, in the mainstream? And we'll break that down because U-Haul, obviously, they don't know any better. They don't know about the carbon-14. They don't know about all these problems that, persist. It's a nagging problem. If the religion of evolution wasn't tax supported, certainly would nag them to death, and it still does, even though they're not even being hurt, and they're still able to publish, and they're still able to teach evolution theory in the textbooks and in the universities. So you really have nothing to worry about, but it does drive them crazy. You watch some of the atheist videos, or, they scoff at creation. But, U-Haul, they obviously just don't know what they're talking about. I mean, because the paradigm is that these animals evolved, that you can date the crust of the earth, and determine its age. But you can determine there's a lot of decay down here and a little bit up here. What does that prove? You can determine where you are in the geologic strata. Does that mean that the strata itself is naturally millions of years old? There's certainly a way to use the information of the radiometric dates to determine where you are in the strata, so you wouldn't look at the Cambrian era, you'd be looking at the Cambrian stage, stage 2 or 3 in the flood, depending on how you want to graph it out. So yeah, you can find relative measurements to determine where you are in the strata. But does that say that the organisms that were fossilized in the strata itself have existed naturally on Earth over millions of years? Well, not necessarily, but that is the paradigm. So why is it the paradigm, and what can we do about it? So share the screen again. In their study of creationist publishing practices, the elusive scientific basis of creation science, quarterly review of biology, Eugene Scott and Henry Cole surveyed the editors of 68 journals for the period from 1980 to 1983, looking for creationist submissions. Out of an estimated 135,000 submitted papers, Scott and Cole found only 18 that could be described as advocating scientific creationism. So not a lot of this stuff goes in for publication, and none of it actually goes through to get published. Dr. Russell Humphreys has a PhD in astrophysics. His creationists such as Humphreys have extensive publications in mainstream journals on non-creationist topics, so topics that either fit the paradigm or, really have nothing to do with millions of years, rather just general observations on astronomy or physics or something. But he publishes in the mainstream journals, but the article by Scott and Cole was a search for articles openly espousing creationism, which is a different matter altogether. So they're actually looking for people who, have submitted, creationist material. It's all been rejected, but at least they were submitting it. And what we see here with Dr. Russell Humphreys is that he actually submits things that are non-creationist related, and they all get published. But we know, from these studies that even if you submit 18 of them, they're all going to get rejected. Now, in the summer of 1985, Humphreys wrote to the journal Science, pointing out that openly creationist articles are suppressed by most journals. He asked if Science had a hidden policy of suppressing creationist letters, and Christine Gilbert, the letter's editor, replied and admitted it is true that we are not likely to publish creationist letters. This admission is particularly significant since Science's official letters policy is that they represent the range of opinions received. Letters must be representative of part of the spectrum of opinions, yet of all the opinions they receive, Science does not print the creationist ones. Humphrey's letter and Miss Gilbert's reply are reprinted in the book by Robert Gentry, and so to say that a slight bias exists on the part of journal editors would be an understatement. They actually do not publish creationist material. There's an obvious paradigm. Robert Gentry, who was denied his PhD dissertation because he wanted to do it on the age of the Earth, and so he settled with a master's degree and started doing work with that. In the 70s and early 80s, physicist Robert Gentry had several articles with very significant creationist data. Let me get rid of this. Published in mainstream journals, Science, Nature, Journal of Geophysical Research, but he found that he couldn't publish openly creationist conclusion. It's the same thing that Humphreys found out. And then Dr. Michael Bay, associate professor of biochemistry at Lay University, author of Darwin's Black Box, is not even a biblical creationist. He just believes in intelligent design. Not necessarily that they didn't evolve, but it was, the primitive cells were created by God or something to that effect. But he's experienced blatant censorship simply because he highlights the strong evidence for an intelligent designer of life. And like Gentry, he wasn't even given a chance to respond to his critics. Another prominent creationist who publishes in mainstream journals but cannot publish creationist material is Dr. Robert Herman, professor of mathematics at the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland. There is an obvious bias in so articles like this, like from creationscience.org by Joe Spears, Accelerated Nuclear Decay Difficulty Solved, Answers in Genesis, Radioisotope Dating Method Problems. The reason that they don't get published is because, the status quo is a market. They have to minimize competing theories, especially ones that they really don't like personally. The people that have the control of the media and the market, and the government funding, and they have those connections. If they have a certain paradigm of their own, they're going to stick to that, especially if that's what's making the most money. But the Scopes monkey trial was the beginning of the scientific community permitting evolution theory to be taught in public schools, and they continue to debate creationists in court cases. So it's still going on where creation versus evolution court cases are happening. Most of the time, the evolutionist wins because the creationists are saying that you can't even teach it, as a theory. So they're getting upset, and rightly so, kind of non-constitutional. So they end up winning most of these cases. And then, of course, you have the National Science Foundation, which the annual budget of the, scientific community from the NSF is 8.3 billion. 25% of all federally supported basic research conducted by the state's colleges and universities. In some fields, such as mathematics, computer science, economics, and the social sciences, the NSF is the major source of federal backing. So they get a lot of money, and none of it goes to creation models, to publish, articles like this. Ever since the very first creation versus evolution trial, scientists, lawyers, politicians, and private sectors of communities have gradually won these court cases, gained access to education and media outlets. In the process of introducing forbidden science at the time, they eventually obtained control of the mainstream research funding programs for government and private investors. Evolution has now evolved to the status quo of marketing scientific information in relation to natural history. Therefore, the paradigm is unlikely to shift without substantial support from the general scientific community. But this would be at the expense of stealing customer traffic from the secular campaigns and advertising themselves as competitors. So if you try to question the status quo, you're going to show yourself a conflict of interest and get fired from your job. Your whole degree is going to be flushed down the toilet, because you got fired from this one job. They gave you a bad reputation or whatever, and nobody's going to hire you. And even if you did get hired, you still can't question the status quo. So you're basically just supposed to take the PhD and be quiet and do work, and then support the conventional wisdom and the mainstream view of things. And if you try to, stop it, that's you're gonna have to have a lot of money and resources in order to even stand a chance. So they've progressively gained the control over the education system, is what it comes down to, and all that we can do is just try to, publish it in any way that we can and gain as much traffic. Just share information on a wide scale. Hopefully, we're looking at viral videos and stuff like that, so that the general population becomes aware, and then there will actually be a market to produce the material. You got to kind of create the market within civilization first. Sometimes it's got to become popular on the inside, and then somebody will produce. Like there's creation institutions that are ready and willing, to use their resources to actually push this, like in universities and in the textbooks. And some public schools actually use creationist material, but the prestigious scientific literature, is outlawing creation. There is an obvious bias, and I think that if the general community, was aware, and there was a market for this, some kind of market opened up, then it would be possible for creationists to publish in the scientific literature. But right now, as far as I can see, evolution theory is a carefully protected state religion, and it really survives only on tax dollars alone, because compared to, the creation model, it's bizarre, its ideas, theories are absurd, and they're in no way scientific. Uh, there's no way to trust the radiometric dates, and there's no signs of evolution in the fossil record itself. So that concludes the after show. Everybody, thank you for tuning in, and stay in prayer. God bless America. Christopher Sylvius is out.